That guy's dead.
16th century England, a slaughterhouse. A pig has just been killed. The carcass is hung upside down by its heels on a heavy wooden frame, so it can bleed out. This is standard practice for every butcher and every farm, literally every single day. And then it happens. The muscles contract, the legs jerk violently, and in one final, involuntary spasm, the pig kicks the beam. The pig, quite literally, kicks the bucket. And without knowing it, you have been referencing that exact moment every single time you've used that phrase. Your whole life. You just didn't know it. And that's where the story gets strange. Almost nobody pictures that scene. Almost everybody pictures something else entirely. Something that's been passed around as the real explanation for centuries, and is almost certainly wrong. Ask anyone where kick the bucket comes from. And if they have an answer, it's going to be some version of this. Someone desperate, alone, stands on a bucket, loops a rope around their neck, and kicks it away. I mean, I get it. It's clean and vivid, and to be honest, it feels exactly like the kind of dark origin a phrase like this should have. That said, there's one problem. The etymological record simply doesn't support it. When researchers trace this phrase back through centuries of actual documents, dictionaries, letters, court records, novels, the hanging theory doesn't show up early. The word bucket in this phrase doesn't behave the way it would need to if that story were true. What's even more interesting is the hanging version doesn't appear in print until the 1800s, well after the phrase was already embedded in common speech. And that gap matters. If the phrase traced back to suicide by hanging, you'd expect to find it earlier. It would likely be in court documents and definitely in coroner's reports. You would also see it in literature that connected that specific act to that specific phrase. But it isn't there. What makes it nearly impossible to dislodge is how it spreads. Once a story like this lands on Wikipedia, in a fun facts listicle, on a trivia card at a bar, it has a distribution system the truth never had. Millions of people read it. They feel clever for knowing it. They repeat it at dinner. And nobody checks the primary sources because the story already felt so satisfying. The confident wrong answer will always outrun the complicated right one, every time. That's what makes folk etymology so dangerous at times. The more vivid the explanation, the faster it spreads. And the faster it spreads, the more people believe it. And eventually a story becomes fact, not because anyone proved it, but because nobody checked. But back to the phrase. So, if it didn't come from a hanging, where did it actually come from? The trail leads to France. The old French word bouquet. B-U-Q-U-E-T. But this wasn't a pail or a container. It was actually a wooden beam. Specifically, a pivoting frame used to suspend heavy objects. The same root that gives us the word trebuchet, the medieval siege weapon that hurled boulders at castle walls. Both words describe the same mechanical idea, something that hangs, balances, and holds weight from above. Now, why was a French word buried inside an English slaughterhouse? The Norman Conquest. When William the Conqueror took England, he brought his language with him. For the next 2 or 3 centuries, French was the language of courts, of nobility, of the church. English was what farmers and laborers spoke. And the two languages spent 300 years bleeding into each other. Somewhere between 10 and 12,000 French words entered English during that period. Most of them you'd recognize immediately. Beef, pork, justice, army. Words that moved up into formal writing, into law, and into literature. But bouquet didn't do that. It stayed low. It lived in the vocabulary of people who worked with their hands. On farms, in slaughterhouses, in the kind of places that don't leave written records, which is exactly why the trail went cold for so long. The people who used this word every day weren't writing it down. They were just working. Now things get strange. That word crossed the English Channel. It settled into the language, and it got anglicized, slowly, over generations, into something that sounded familiar. Bouquet became bucket, not the pail you're thinking of, the beam. And that beam ended up in one very specific place in 16th and 17th century England. The slaughterhouse. When a pig was slaughtered, the carcass couldn't just lie on the ground, it had to be elevated, hung by the heels on a heavy wooden frame so the blood could drain properly and efficiently. It was done thousands of times a day across rural England for generations. That frame that it was elevated from was called a bucket. Not because anyone was confused about what a bucket was, because the word bouquet had made the journey from Old French through the English Channel into the vocabulary of every butcher and farmer in the country. And that leads us to where we started with the pig. The muscles contract, the legs jerk, and then one final involuntary spasm. The pig kicks the bucket. Francis Grose, an 18th century British antiquarian who spent his life documenting informal English, recorded the phrase in his 1785 Classical Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue. The context he provides points squarely at agricultural, rural use. Not suicide or desperation, but a slaughterhouse. The hanging theory came later, and it won, likely because it's a better story. It was more dramatic and just easier to picture. But a better story doesn't mean a true story. The word bucket in this phrase has never meant a pail. It's been carrying the ghost of a French word for a wooden beam for over 400 years, and almost nobody knows it. Every comedian who's ever used this phrase, every obituary writer who snuck it in knowing the deceased would have laughed. Every person who's ever leaned over at work and whispered it, all of them are picturing the wrong image and just saying something they didn't actually understand. But that's what idioms do. They move through the language every single day, hiding histories nobody checks. The words change. The original image fades. What's left is a phrase that survives, not because people understand it, but because it does a job nothing else quite does. In this case, it makes death easier to say out loud. Dark humor has always been how humans process the unbearable. Roman soldiers, medieval peasants, Victorian novelists writing about death, but with a wink. And you've used it maybe just last week, without a second thought. Kick the bucket isn't going anywhere. It shows up in movies, in eulogies, in text messages sent between people who are too close to say the actual word. It's become almost affectionate, a way of acknowledging death while keeping it at arm's length, which is exactly what it was always designed to do. So, tell me something. Before you watch this, did you just use the phrase without ever questioning it? Nothing wrong with that. We've all done it. If so, let me know in the comments. Should be interesting. And next time, we're going into a phrase you've said hundreds of times, one that sounds like it's about willpower and discipline, but the actual origin has nothing to do with either of those things, and it only dates back about 100 years.